If you're familiar with the role that the Jasons have played.
Today we welcome Anne Finkbeiner here, who's going to tell us an amazing story of an elite group of scientists who lend the federal government their minds for a few weeks in the summer.
I first heard about Jason at a physics colloquium at Johns Hopkins back in 1990. My husband, who is now retired, was a condensed matter experimentalist in that department, and afterward I went with him to a dinner for the speaker, who was Freeman Dyson. He was doing a Jason study, he said. "What's Jason?" I asked. I don't remember what he said, but it was not an answer. So I spent the next few months working on a story for Science magazine about Jason, and then 10 years later spent about 4 years writing a book about them. Jason is usually written in capital letters as though it's an acronym for something, but it isn't. It's just the name.
You are familiar?
Yes.
How would you categorize their performance over the last 60, 70 years?
I found their reports to be fulsome and very, the members of Jason's being very knowledgeable, but I can tell you that they are rich in history and their technical expertise is sound.
The earliest Jasons had been young Manhattan Project scientists, or the students of those scientists. So they inherited the Manhattan Project sensibilities that sometimes, as scientists, you can almost inadvertently come up with the most god-awful weapons. When Jason was born, DOD called the group Project Sunrise.
Working in secrecy, they tackle problems of defense, of space exploration, of environmental and global concerns. Meeting since 1960, the Jasons have been responsible for some major breakthroughs.
In any case, they're generally hotshots. Of the roughly 100 Jasons over time, 42 have been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, 8 have won MacArthur Awards, 1 won Mathematics Fields Medal, and 11 have Nobel Prizes.
I was then invited by Goldberger, I think, to join this group, Jason.
Jason turns out to be a bunch of academic scientists,
which at that time was a group of young physicists
who spend their summers doing largely secret work,
advising the government, or rather doing technical work for the government on all kinds of questions, not only military questions, but also various civilian questions.
They started back in 1960 as part of the government's reaction to Sputnik. Many of the early Jasons were theoretical physicists, and though they branched out into other sciences, physicists are still overrepresented. Jasons work in groups of 1 or 3 or 10 from mid-June through the end of July. They meet in a secure building leased from General Atomics in La Jolla.
It means spending 6 weeks every year doing technical work on various interesting problems.
Depending on how they're counted, they number between 30 and 60 at any given time, and they all have top secret clearances, at least.
And it's a negotiation between the members and the government. We have to find sponsors in the government for things we're interested in, and so they have to agree to pay us so much for working so many days on a particular problem.
As you'd expect, they are extremely independent.
The reason the government likes us is because we are independent.
Jasons were and still are invited to join not by the government, but only by other Jasons.
The requirement for joining Jason is you have to have a tenured position so that you can always quit if you disagree with the government, and you're also not bound to any industrial organization.
Jason management, working with a government sponsor, decides which questions they're going to study. Jasons themselves work only on those studies they want to work on. They show up for summer studies when and how often they want to.
So it has to be interesting to us as well as interesting to them.
They don't need the money. They don't need the work.
Our jobs are not at stake.
They can be fired at any minute and not particularly care. They are beholden to no one in any part of the government.
So we can be independent umpires when there are competing bids on a contract.
This level of independence is unusual for government advisors and has occasionally gotten Jason into trouble.
So we don't allow people to join Jason who are employees of a company, and we don't allow people who are still waiting to get tenure at universities.
Jason is asked questions by various parts of the Defense Department, and in particular for its first 40 years by DARPA.
We do have some ongoing studies with Jasons.
The questions are about the technical problems of missile defense or anti-submarine warfare our nuclear test detection,
Nuclear and other forms of scientific expertise.
Jasons have been responsible for some major breakthroughs, including the electronic battlefield, or the sensor barrier, the laser guide star, a three-dimensional mapping of the ocean system, and many others.
or climate change, and in these days, bioterror and urban warfare. And between half and three-quarters of these questions are classified.
On the whole, the thing has worked extremely well over the years, but I think we've done a great deal to save money inside the government, especially in the military, because there are many expensive and very stupid things that the military does. So we've actually saved the money that would otherwise have been wasted.
And if you do that, then you're responsible for how those weapons get controlled. So many of Jason's early studies were in support of the various treaties to ban nuclear tests. For instance, could a bad guy sneakily test his nuclear bomb in an underground cavern which would muffle its seismic signature so we wouldn't know he'd tested it? As it turns out, yes, he could, but only if the bomb were uninterestingly small, 1 kiloton or so. Jason's early days were also the post-Sputnik glory years of science advising that was listened to and science funding that was generous. So Jason invented a way of communicating with submarines in the deep ocean by setting up an antenna thousands of miles long and sending out an extremely low-frequency signal that would bounce between the bedrock of the Earth and the ionosphere. So they went into the Vietnam War and invented a nice little gizmo for the Air Force to use. But the Vietnam era was not like the Manhattan Project era, and Jason's university colleagues and students didn't think the Jasons were heroes. Quite the contrary. Jasons were public villains. So over the years, Jason has branched out away from DARPA to the intelligence community, Navy, NASA, Air Force, Department of Energy, and therefore away from physicists to mathematicians, material scientists, computer scientists, oceanographers, chemists, climate scientists, and engineers of all sorts. Their work is classified, and even when it isn't, if you ask a government bureaucrat whether Jason does him any good, his answer will be something like, Jason has traditionally been an asset to our agency.
So I can express to you my opinion on the two recent studies that were undertaken by Jason's, one of which was a tritium study. I found their reports to be fulsome and very, the members of Jason's being very knowledgeable about issues associated with our programs at NNSA. I can't speak to the history or the 60, 70 years of Jason's, but I can tell you that they are rich in history and their technical expertise is sound. I've actually asked my staff, Chairman, to look into it to see what's happening, because we do have some studies that we're undertaking with Jason, so we want to make sure that if there are some issues associated with contract management, that somebody handles that, because we do have some ongoing studies with Jason's.
Which could mean anything at all. And anyway, government policy is made the way sausage is, and you can't trace the end product back to any particular piece of advice. The Jasons themselves say they don't really know whether they're doing any good or not, and the bottom line is they must be, or they wouldn't still be in business.